Welcome, everyone, to another edition of the Maqdisi Street podcast. My name is Sari Maqdisi, and I'm joined by my brothers Usama
Hello, everyone.
and Karim.
Hi, everyone.
And I'll shortly be introducing our special guest for today. I want to say before we begin that my brothers and I started this podcast in the context of Israel's genocidal campaign in Gaza to provide perspectives and analysis that aren't available in the mainstream media or even in most independent media either. If you're learning from this show and would like others to have access to it, please consider subscribing and giving it a 5-star rating, just not for our egos, but rather literally to make the show more visible on podcasting platforms. In order to cover the cost of producing the show, we've added a Patreon membership. So if you are in a position to do so, please subscribe to one of our Patreon levels in order, again, to keep the podcast going and make it as available and accessible to others as possible. We'll be adding bonus content there, including question and answer shows and extra material such as recordings of our own lectures and interviews we conduct with other guests. For example, Karim recently interviewed someone in UNIFIL, and that will be available on our Patreon stream. Patreon members can also post their questions on the Patreon page, and we'll address those questions in an upcoming show. But back to today's show, we're all joined by a very special guest, Dr. Hanan Ashrawi. And, sometimes the phrase goes that sometimes you introduce somebody about whom you say they need no introduction. It's not always the case, but at this time, it really is the case. I don't really need to introduce Dr. Ashrawi, but of course I will. Dr. Ashrawi was born and raised in Palestine and completed her schooling there, then went to AUB in Beirut to study English literature, and then on to University of Virginia for a PhD in comparative literature. She returned to Birzeit University in Ramallah, or outside Ramallah, where she taught and was the chair of English and then eventually the dean of the Faculty of Arts, and she's published several important studies of Palestinian literature during her academic career. Most of us, or I'm sure many of our listeners, probably got to know of Dr. Ashrawi when she rose to prominence as a spokesperson for the Palestinian delegation to the peace talks held at Madrid in the period before Oslo in the early 1990s. And immediately she struck global audiences, not only for her political composure and poise, but also for her impeccable English, which is unfortunately all too rare a thing among certain Palestinian spokespeople. After Oslo, Dr. Ashrawi served briefly as a Minister of Higher Education in the Palestinian Authority, but then resigned her position. She's also been elected to the Palestinian Legislative Council representing Jerusalem and was elected as a member of the Executive Committee of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the only woman on that body, although she resigned from the PLO in 2020. In 1998, Dr. Ashrawi also founded Miftah, the Palestinian Initiative for the Promotion of Global Dialogue and Democracy, and she still serves on its board of directors. So, Dr. Ashrawi, welcome to our show. Welcome to Maqdisi Street. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you. It's good to be with you.
We thought we would begin, just given the situation in Gaza, by asking you. You're not in Gaza, but you're in the West Bank. What life is like right now for you? Then we'll follow some of these larger pictures, of course, the larger issues we want to get back to. But just on a day-to-day basis, there you are. We talk about military occupation. Well, you're living under military occupation. What's it like? What's day-to-day life right now, especially?
You're talking about the West Bank in particular, right? Because we're sitting here in our own prisons, in our own separate prison cells, because as you know, the West Bank is under siege, again, with no freedom of movement whatsoever, whether internally or externally. And every single town, city, village is surrounded by checkpoints. We have over 700 checkpoints now in the West Bank. And of course, and Jerusalem, definitely, and with the army and with the settlers on the rampage, generally terrorizing the Palestinian people at will, with the support of the army, and of course armed by the Israeli government, especially Ben Gvir, who's gleefully handing out death machines to all these settlers to use with full impunity. with several pogroms having taken place in Hawara and Turmasaya and other places. So this is a very dangerous place to be in. It's very restrictive and restricting. Daily people are using their lands, Palestinians. The expansion of settlements is just incredible, unbelievable how they just grab the land and they put their mobile units or whatever, and they claim it as theirs. That's it, with no buy or leave, or with nobody ever holding them accountable, knowing that, of course, the theft of land and the settlements enterprise are both war crimes. And they're, pursuing these in a bid to carry out systematic ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. And there are several areas and population centers, so-called, in the West Bank that have been completely evacuated because of these attacks, and people are terrified without any protection. So this kind of life where you see full lawlessness and violence, and the Israeli occupation gives itself the right to determine the value of your life and your time and your freedom and so on, by your leave, without any kind of intervention. This has been ongoing, and it is now escalating. Now that everybody's looking at the horrific genocide in Gaza, the death machine in the West Bank is still grinding on, daily killing people. Hundreds of Palestinians have been killed since October 7th. And at the same time, thousands have been abducted. People talk about Israeli hostages. To us, all our prisoners are hostages. They have all been kidnapped. We have over 11,000 now from the West Bank and Jerusalem who are in Israeli prisons. 3,000 of them at least under administrative detention, which means with no trial, with no evidence, with no due process whatsoever. So here you have this other kind of lawlessness. So no judiciary, no legal system, no justice, and the ethnic cleansing ongoing. So it's a very difficult and tense and situation to live in which you have one occupying power that is acting with full impunity without any intervention. And the Palestinians are entirely vulnerable, by the way, because should any Palestinian try to resist in any way, not even using, arms or armed struggle, even using a stone or so on, either he or she is shot or is deemed a terrorist and is arrested. And now in Israeli jails, as you know, the whole issue of torture has just become everywhere, rampant. They're torturing
and we've heard
everybody.
so much about the so-called rape on October 7th, but we know as part of the torture, there's regular sexual abuse that goes on.
Yes,
in Israeli prisons.
There is not just harassment, but now it has been proven there has been rape in Israeli prisons. And of course, systematic physical torture and inhuman, horrible conditions. Without any clothes, sleeping on the floor, overcrowded conditions, with not enough food or water or hygiene and so on. So it's a systematic way of degrading people, inflicting pain, dehumanizing them, not only in their own minds, but also in the way in which they treat them. And this continues. And not to mention, I'm talking about 11,000 from the West Bank and Jerusalem, but there are thousands that nobody knows of that keep getting detained from Gaza. They just pick them up, as you've seen footage of them being stripped, being treated like animals. You heard the story of the doctor who was tied up and placed on a leash and was supposed to walk on all fours and to eat from a plate and so on, while being beaten all the time in front of the way they want to break the spirit of people, not just the body. And this is just systematic and deliberate. And I don't know what kind of sick mind can do that to others. What kind of snipers can shoot children and a mother and child walking down the street just for fun? This is incredible. And I'm sure everybody is noticing this, the fact that there is now developing as a result of Israel's impunity and preferential treatment and exceptionalism, there is also a sense of arrogance fed by a culture of hate and superiority, and that they are entitled to do whatever they want to everybody else. And this total dehumanization of the Palestinian actually robs the Israelis and the Israeli public of their own humanity, in a sense, because you have to shed the least semblance of humanity if you give yourself license to do these things to others.
So,
Dr.
Hanan,
Ashrawi, just 1 sec. So just on this, the thing about occupation. Sorry, because we're going to come back to the urgent things you're talking about. But just so people know, I mean, we're familiar with. We haven't lived under occupation, but we've written about it and read about it and so forth. But just so that people know, even if the nightmare of Gaza wasn't happening right now, even if the terrible crisis right now wasn't underway, you live in Ramallah. So just like let's say that its conditions are normal, right? Which of course they never are under occupation. But you want to go visit. I think you were born in Nablus. So how easy is it to get from Ramallah to Nablus? Is to go see somebody there, or just to go see where you were born, or what? Just tell our listeners, what is it like to be under occupation under normal circumstances, not under conditions of the crisis right now?
Well, I don't go anywhere these days. We all live in our own bubbles. We cannot move. But to go to Nablus is a major risk that you take, because you don't know how many checkpoints there are. You don't know which roads you can take. You don't know if the settlers are on the rampage, or you have to go through Hawara where they are there, shooting and killing and so on, or if you're going to go through the other road, or Wadi al-Haramiyya, or you get to see from Turmusaya, the settlers who are again trying to burn homes and people. Look, everybody now is unable to move and doesn't want to move anywhere. By the way, I was born in Nablus because my father was stationed there as a doctor. So, and then they moved to Tiberias, and in 1948 I was a baby, but that was when they experienced the Nakba and moved out of Tiberias. So to go to Nablus, which I haven't done in a long time, is taking a major risk. To go to Jerusalem is a major risk, because many of the roads are closed. They close up roads, they put checkpoints, they put... now they're building actually huge fences and gates in front of villages and towns and cities. Like the main access outside Ramallah to go to Jerusalem, which is also a bypass road, is the DCO. They decided to close the DCO. So you have to go all the way to Bir Zayt, and from Bir Zayt go also further north and then turn south. So we used to go to Jerusalem in 15, 20 minutes. Now it takes an hour and a half at least. That is, if the road is safe, if you don't get stopped, if there are no checkpoints. And there are also what is called the mobile checkpoints that can come up at will at any point and stop you and delay you or detain you. And many young people, especially those going to universities. That's why we're having a hard time at Bir Zayt University. And by the way, I'm now chairperson of the board of trustees of Bir Zayt University, a position of which I'm very proud and dedicated to. Anyway, so the students are afraid of going to the university because they are in front of or surrounding every city and village and camp. There are checkpoints, and the army habitually arrests or detains people. And sometimes they shoot people at checkpoints. So especially young people, they don't want to. And of course, they storm the university, they detain students from the university, and so on. So any semblance of normal life is missing. And the whole idea of making people live in a state of constant insecurity and fear, this does something to you, because the occupation is the most intrusive and pervasive kind of infliction of pain and terror and so on. And they do it as a matter of form daily, So you can't take anything for granted. You don't have a normal life. And that to us is I keep thinking, what gives those people the right to do this to a whole nation, to a whole population? What gives them the right? And they do it sometimes with glee and sometimes, very cheerfully that they are able to do this, as you see them in Gaza, picking off people, shooting them, demolishing, blowing up homes. So there's nothing called normal. The occupation is a state of abnormality that is absolutely inhuman. And the pain it inflicts is persistent and daily and incremental. And it's something you cannot even expect at times. And I worry because there are also the young people, especially in the north, in Nablus, Jenin, Tulkarem, Falqilia, and so on, plus, of course, in the south, in Khalil, Hebron, and in Bethlehem. They are seeking out young people who are picking up the mantle of resistance, and they are carrying out extrajudicial executions now, as you know. Not only that, but they bring their bulldozers and they tear up the roads. They destroy the infrastructure, they destroy the water system, the electricity, the sewage system, everything, to make life intolerable for Palestinians there. And then, of course, they unleash the settlers who feel that they have the power of life and death, primarily of death, over the Palestinians, who destroy your crops, your homes, your trees, and then steal your land, steal your sheep, kill your sheep for fun. That's something that the Palestinians now are experiencing as an overall assault on everything that makes life livable. But it is done, and I would say mainly in secret, because the world is not noticing this. It is done systematically and sort of semi-quietly, so to speak, but it is in the service of an ethnic cleansing agenda and an expansionist agenda of a settler colonial system that sees the natives as subhuman, and therefore they can do whatever they want to the indigenous people, and they can steal their land, their lives, their resources, the future of their children. And this is extremely, I would say, evil. I don't usually use this term, but it is evil.
So, Dr. Hanan, I mean, that is, it's extraordinary, the litany of cruelty that you've just outlined. And of course, for our viewers and listeners, it's important, I think, and you were saying this and alluding to this is a system that long predates, obviously, October 7th. This has been going on for decades and decades. So the question I have for you, or we have for you, is twofold. One is, could you ever have imagined, I mean, given this cruelty, is the genocide in Gaza, what's going on in Gaza, is this an exponential increase in this cruelty? Is this something you could have imagined? Was this something that in your since you've worked and you've lived under occupation and you've studied and you've taught and you've lived in this system of extraordinary cruelty that's mostly unseen to most of the world, but the Gaza genocide is overt. Everyone in the world sees it through social media and so on. Could you have ever imagined this situation? And second of all, the other question is the situation in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem as an extension of this sort of, could you imagine where you are 20 years ago when you started working? Because we want to get to the PA and the PLO. Could you have imagined this is where we would end up in 2024?
When we used to hear about the Nakba from our parents and your grandparents, probably, it was a thing of the past. And it was more abstract because we heard about Deir Yassin, all the massacres, Tantura, Kufr Qasim, Lid, all these massacres, and somehow they were things of the past. And the whole destruction and erasure of 500 and some villages in Palestine. Again, this was something in the past. That 48, 47, 48, 14, even up to 51, this was something that Israel did at a certain period of time. Then gradually you began to understand that this is ongoing, particularly in the Palestinians of 48, by the way. They were under military rule for quite some time. And now they are under a system of apartheid in Israel and totally discriminated against the 48 Palestinians. And now it's become very apparent how they have always been subject to discrimination and oppression. This is one. What October 7 did and the following, I don't see October 7 as separate from a continuum. This is a trajectory that has been ongoing from before 1948. We want to go back to the Balfour Declaration and the fact that they described us by what we are not. We are not non-Jewish populations, non-Jewish communities, not even, and that we have only civil and religious rights, nothing else. So from there on, the dehumanization and abstraction and erasure of the Palestinians continued. And the granting of Israel of special privileges and the impunity and immunity to do what it wants proceeded. So these trajectories continued. So when, for example, the last 5 times that Israel targeted Gaza, for example, placed it under siege and bombed and shelled, it was, in a sense, a foretaste of what's happening now. You remember how they destroyed whole neighborhoods, whole areas, how they eradicated, obliterated 91 families at one point from the population register in Gaza. Now they are doing this exponentially in the whole areas of Gaza. So that is something I never expected to happen, because I kept thinking that, post-Second World War, that we do have a world order, that there is some sort of multilateral system where a global rule of law would prevail, where aggressors would be held accountable, where the vulnerable will be protected, and so on. Even though we all knew it was imperfect, but I could never imagine the degree of impunity and the degree of protection and collusion that Israel would enjoy. Complicity by the West. This is one thing. And I could never imagine how we were treated with such total disregard to our humanity and our rights. The hypocrisy of the West and the racism that emerged, to me, is just incredibly shocking. And what happened now, as I said, I could not imagine this, because we were comfortable in our humanity, as Palestinians. We knew we were human. We are people of accomplishments. We are people of history, of culture. And we are proud of this and identity and so on. And we never thought that we could be relegated to such a level of subhuman species. Not even animals, because people don't treat animals like this, like they do anywhere in Gaza. This exposed, as I said the other day, exposed several fault lines in the world globally. It exposed the inherent and ongoing racism of the colonial system in the world. It exposed the hypocrisy of the so-called rule of law or rules-based order in the world. It exposed the fact that there are, in a sense, systems that would not just allow for, but support war crimes and genocide for the sake of political ends, and very narrow political ends. And of course, the North-South divide came out, the global South. It's not by chance that it is South Africa that took Israel to court, to ICJ, on charges of genocide. And you're beginning to see this now very clearly, that the whole impetus, the whole colonial drive of the Western, white, primarily male, primarily Christian, supremacist mentality is still there. And of course, combine that with their guilt over what they did in the Holocaust, which is, of course, is a Western European phenomenon. It is not ours. But of course, that's how they tried to appease their own sense of guilt. In a sense, combined with that, meant that they give Israel a free hand to do whatever they wanted, and they totally disregard us as victims. So this type of extremism is something, and it came out in the open, and that's what's so shocking. Now, they didn't even bother to hide it. They didn't bother to disguise it. They didn't bother to use words from the beginning. You remember when October 7th, Biden came out and repeated all these false allegations without verification, without waiting to see, and then accused us of being liars when the numbers of Palestinians being slaughtered in an unprecedented carnage, and he wouldn't believe it. He didn't want to see it. It was very clear. And when you had Blinken coming in and giving his credentials by saying, I'm Jewish, so what? Who cares what your religion is? Do you have to give credentials to Israel that I'm one of the tribe? Is this a tribal issue? Or is this an issue of humanity and rights and justice and freedom and humanitarian law and so on? No. So this exposure to all of us, I think to the world, was shocking. And I never imagined I would see this, frankly. I knew that the Zionist mentality is there, and I knew that Zionism is based on exclusivity and exclusion, on claiming superior rights, and so on, and on racism, of course, as seen in the nation-state law in Israel, that only Jews have the right to self-determination in Palestine or in Israel, as they say. So things are revealed gradually until matters came to a head. And if this whole trajectory had not been allowed to continue and to persist, you wouldn't have seen this. You wouldn't have seen this arrogance, this lack of willingness to recognize the humanity of others, this sense of excessive use of entitlement and privilege and so on.
Dr. Hanan, sorry to interrupt, but because you've been, talking about Blinken and coming the first round when he came and said, "I'm here first as a Jew," to preach to people in our region, which is quite extraordinary, given even the work that Osama and others have done on coexistence and the kind of history of where we come from. But speaking of this level of impunity and the level of we just as we're having this interview, the U.S. has just now cast its third veto at the UN Security Council to veto the ceasefire resolution that Algeria and the Arab group had put in place, and I think the UK also just abstained. Yeah. So with this kind of impunity, and here we are, and 30,000 confirmed killed in Gaza. You're talking about this genocide that's taking place, and that's the ethnic cleansing that's unfolding even in the West Bank and other areas. It's all one large story with different components in it. How is it that, and we want to get to the question of the PLO and the PA very soon, but just sort of your kind of immediate impressions of this. Again, Osama had asked you earlier about, could you imagine the US being to this extent in the middle of an actual genocide, that they would still be casting vetoes and stopping all sorts of international diplomacy that the entire world now understands and agrees there are priorities? Could you, how should we understand this kind of thing? Is there something, or is it just pure, as you're saying, just pure racism, colonialism, and that's how we need to understand it?
And the essence of the exercise of unbridled power in the service of self-interest. I think there's personal self-interest, Biden and his elections prospects. And, you all know the nature of the beast in the US when it comes to elections, and who funds and who pays and who delivers votes and so on. But also, I think Biden is essentially, as he declared himself, is a Zionist. And he's such a blind Zionist that he didn't even want to stop and think about what he saw. He didn't want to verify what he was told. He didn't want to think of the other side, of the Palestinian side, people who've been 17 years under siege, so many decades under occupation and so on, deprived of rights. No, it doesn't matter What it matters is that some Israelis were hurt, so no holds barred, everything is allowed. This mindlessness to me, this lack of contextualization, the lack of critical assessment and analysis, and we are in literature and we know what it means to have a critical distance and to be able to examine fully, comprehensively what you're looking at and to seek evidence. Even if you want to be creative, it has to be based on some knowledge. No, they didn't. And of course, as I said, presenting his credentials as being Jewish, as I said, it tried to present things as a tribal issue and as a religious issue, which to us is extremely dangerous. Because as you know, Palestinians have always had a diverse culture, and we've always had Christians, Muslims, Jews, non-believers, if you will. There's no reason, to present this as a Jewish issue, unless you adopt the Zionist mentality, which they have. The Zionist ideology is the basis of this. Because if you think that you are entitled and that you are exclusive and that you can adopt exclusionary politics, then you can do unto others, whatever you want. The Biden, Blinken, and what's his name? I keep forgetting his name. Secretary of Defense.
Austin,
yes. Lloyd Austin. The three of them, so there are certain words that cannot be uttered in public. So the three of them somehow managed to create this bubble of, and this total identification with Israel, militarily, in terms of ideology, in terms of human identification, and in terms of total disregard for the humanity of the other. And the whole issue of sending arms and weapons and armaments, and it's just incredible. And all this money and funds, and even bypassing Congress to be able to send more weapons to Israel. And they participated actually in the planning. They attended the war cabinet meetings. You know that. And they sent experts. So they are complicit. Many people are saying this is America's war, that if the US wants to stop it, it could have stopped it. The use of veto repeatedly was to buy Israel more time, to continue to kill more, to wreak havoc, to destroy more. And they adopted Israel's priorities. In language, they talk about the hostages. We are in a sensitive, delicate phase of negotiations. And if you vote for a ceasefire, it would undermine delicate talk. What delicate talks? Netanyahu is treating you with absolute contempt. You go pleading, you go, beseeching, you're asking. And he just says, he thumbs his nose to be polite and says, you can do whatever, you can say whatever you like. I'm doing whatever I want. And I want total victory. What is total victory? What is absolute victory? Totally destroy. As he told his own army at one point, he said he wants to thin out, the thinning of the population. You can imagine anything more horrible, horrific. It's not just, as I said, mowing the lawn, it's the thinning of the population. And then, of course, the expulsion and so on, which they did in 48. But that's, I'm sorry, we are being carried away, but that's the issue. The issue is that I could never imagine a state, and even the US and even the Democratic Party, the so-called Democratic Party that generally claims to protect human rights, to adhere to humanitarian law and international and so on, would be party to such carnage, to such a slaughter of innocents, really, and would defend it and would buy more time and would adopt the language and priorities of the occupier and of the aggressor and dismiss. And then when Biden started seeing that, especially in the swing states, as you know, whether in Michigan or Pennsylvania or even in Florida, that there are people of conscience. It's not the fact that they're Palestinian Americans or Muslim Americans or Arab Americans, There are Black Americans, there are indigenous Americans, there are women, the women's movement, even the Latino, the Latin
young Americans above all. They're extraordinary. Yeah.
the people who felt that they have been deceived all their lives. The conventional wisdom of Israel, right or wrong, is now being challenged by young people, as you said, who have access now to the truth.
Dr. Hanan, if I can, I want to, it's because this is fascinating, and we want to get back to this, but we want to, if I can push you a little bit on the question of where is the PLO at this point and the PA? So in all this representation, where is the voice of the Palestinian Authority, which is in principle meant to be, to speak of the PLO and the PA? Where is this voice? We hear them, of course, at the ICJ hearing. There was it's represented at the UN. Fantastic speeches, fantastic, oratory in some cases. But in general, on the question of Gaza, on what's going on in the West Bank today, we want to get, segue into this and of course talk about your kind of history with this and your reflections and your understandings from these long negotiations. But if we can start, like, where are they now? Where is this voice to try to counter Egypt, to try to counter all these countries around?
Well, that's a very good question. And it's a very relevant question, because now people are trying to revive the Palestinian political system, to upgrade it, to innovate it, to change it, and so on, in order to become a better protector of Israeli security. Let me say frankly, look, the PLO, to all Palestinians, is a very important institution. It's a body that represents Palestinians everywhere, and it is something that we created at a great cost and expense. And it represents or embodies our right to self-determination, to statehood, to nationhood, to representation, and so on, so that people know that wherever they are as Palestinians, they have this inclusive system and a democratic system of representation, as far as we can manage this. With the signing of the agreements, and as you know, I don't know how far back I want to go to discuss this, but when we went to Madrid for negotiations, we went in order actually to give the PLO legitimacy and a voice, and to show that we were the people of the PLO and that we do have a representative body, and to defy attempts at silencing and excluding and delegitimizing the PLO. This was one of our objectives. Even people were being shot at and killed if they, said that they defended the PLO or they carried the Palestinian flag or whatever during the Intifada. So we went with that objective, and we said the PLO cost the Palestinians a lot to build, to establish, and to have it as an inclusive, comprehensive, representative system. And of course, it suffered several setbacks, as you know, Lebanon, and then the expulsion, and then going to Tunis, and at its weak point in Tunis, there was a need to revitalize the PLO, to gain its legitimacy and recognition as an address for all the Palestinians. So this is something we tried to do. And at the same time, there was, let's say, an international, an American Western attempt at dissolving, at destroying the PLO. They wanted to deal only with functional, administrative, technical Palestinians, and not with political Palestinians who have the power of representation and a political dimension. That's why we refused, and we insisted that we are representing the PLO, which represents. Anyway, after the signing of the Declaration of Principles, which is the first agreement of the so-called Oslo process, and it was a severely flawed agreement. We can talk about this, and Edward was absolutely right. Edward Said in rejecting and seeing all the pitfalls and flaws inherent in it. So after that, there was an attempt that was even within the Palestinian political system to somehow reduce the power of the PLO, to weaken the PLO by establishing the PA, or what was called the PNA then, which was established as part of the agreement to deliver services and to build institutions, to run the lives of people in the West Bank and Gaza. And part of the land, for part of the time, it was supposed to be temporary until the final status talks are concluded and you have a two-state solution. So the PA became stronger and stronger and started taking on the role of the PLO, not just as a functional system, which is what it was supposed to be, but as a functional system that took over political decision-making. And the PLO was gradually weakened. One of the reasons why I accepted to run for I didn't leave the PLO. I don't leave the PLO. I left the executive committee, please, because I didn't want an official position and I didn't want to be party to this whole system. So gradually it was weakened, and I accepted to run for office. And every office I took, I was elected for, because I don't like to be appointed. I don't like to be beholden to anybody. So that I tried very hard from within the PLO to try to activate, revive, empower the PLO executive as the decision maker in Palestine. And to say that we are the reference. The PLO is supposed to be the sort of all-encompassing political reference for the PA, which is the functional service delivery institutional setup that was set up by the Central Council of the PLO. Unfortunately, it didn't work. Gradually, it
Dr.
was...
Hanan, that's you put your finger on it just there. I mean, so you were always on the inside, of course, but those of us on the outside, like when we were younger and protesting, I remember in the 1980s, for example, our main demand as protesters in the US when we were students and so on was always the PLO is the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. Of course, we have Arafat and the UN and all these kinds of things. So I have two questions now. I mean, I want you just to elaborate a little bit more, because in a way, when we say the sole legitimate representative, I mean, there's an exclusivity by definition to that, right? So, but now, of course, as you've been saying, and I want you to build a little bit more on this, if you could, please. The PA and the PLO, yeah, and it's sort of muddied now. Like which is more? I mean, you're basically saying many of the functions of the PLO have been subsumed by the PA, or like the PA should have been accountable to the PLO, but it seems like if anything, it's the other way around. And there's also a third thing I'd like you to come back to too, which is, because remember, Edward was a member of the Palestine National Council, which I always thought was like the kind of supra somehow to the PLO in a way. And that's like, yeah, exactly, a parliament in exile. So, but that also seems, as far as I can tell, that seems to have dropped. So when we say as Palestinians, the PLO is the sole legitimate representative, how do we balance that there's the PLO, there's the PA, there's the PNC, there's this thing called the State of Palestine, which has a seat in the UN, or at least observer status in the UN. So how do we, I mean, first of all, which one is the sole legitimate representative, and how do we reconcile these things with each other?
Yeah, well, it's good you asked this, because people somehow get confused by so many different bodies, but the PLO is made up of several bodies. The PNC is the basic body, which is the parliament, which is the representative body, made up of representatives of different political factions and armed struggle groups and so on. So it has political representation in that sense, that each party or faction elects or chooses its own representatives to the National Council, the PNC, which is the largest body. And of course, then you have representatives of trade unions, representative of sectoral bodies like the General Union of Palestine Students, where I started my political activism in the late 60s when I first met Edward. So anyway, so you have the General Union of Palestine Students, the General Union of Palestine Women, all are still somehow semi-active. General Union of Palestine Journalists and so on. These are all associations and unions and representative bodies that elect their own representatives to be members of the PNC. Because in exile, this is what the best you can do. You even had federations like Ramallah Federation and Bethlehem and so on, electing their representatives to the PNC in exile. Sorry. So in that sense, it was the best you could do, as Yasser Arafat used to say, Abu Ammar, we used to have a democracy, even a democracy of guns. But we had a democracy because we insisted on having this type of representation. And it is, in many ways, where you could have elections, you would, but there are many places where you couldn't. So when we had elections in the West Bank and Gaza for the PLC, for the Palestine Legislative Council, the members of the PLC automatically became members of the PNC. We were the elected part, directly elected, to represent the Palestinians of the West Bank and Gaza and Jerusalem and Gaza to the PNC, but we were PLC, which is the Legislative Council within Palestine then, because not all the PLO was in Palestine, not all the PNC representatives. Now, the PNC also selected a smaller body because the PNC was huge, hundreds and hundreds of members, and selected 120 or 130 member body, called it the Central Council, which is what we call the intervening body between the PNC and the Executive Committee. The Executive Committee is elected by the PNC. The Executive Committee is the government, so to speak. You elect these members who are supposed to formulate policy and so on, and they are the executive arm of the legislative or representative parliamentary body, which is the PNC. So all these are the PLO. And as such, it functioned. It functioned outside Palestine and somewhat functioned within Palestine, but then gradually the PLC became more powerful because it was on the ground, because it was elected by people there. Gradually, the PA, the Palestine Authority, or the Palestine National Authority, which was appointed. It was first appointed by the PLO. I remember we were in Tunis when we chose the members of the government. So the PA has a government, a governing and executive body. So you have a dual system. You have the PA that has a government, that has a legislative authority, and that has a judiciary. And we legislated laws to govern the relationships, knowing that these PA institutions were under the supervision, direction of the PLO. Okay? Gradually, the PLO is weakened, as I said. Its powers and responsibilities were taken over by the PA. The ministers became, of course, much more powerful than executive committee members. Ultimately, it shrank to the point where, at one point, the president dissolved the PLC, the elected Legislative Council, saying that its time has passed. And then gradually legislation became a matter of the government, of the PA, and laws were passed by decree from the president. So the executive authority was more and more concentrated in the presidential system. And without an oversight body and a legislative body like the PLC, you ended up with the executive body taking over everything. And then they legislated to place the legislature, the judicial system under the control of the executive system. So they collapsed the whole system. I'm sorry, this is very complicated. So the whole system collapsed into the presidential system.
It's fascinating because you're basically describing the creation of a virtual Arab state, an anti-democratic Arab state, but virtual, without even having any sovereignty whatsoever.
Without the state.
Without the state, exactly. So the question I have for you, to go back to this other, a more personal question, and this is really to educate our viewers and our listeners. The when you described Edward's sort of interview in 1990, or his piece about the Oslo process being a Palestinian Versailles, a surrender, a declaration of surrender, an instrument of surrender, if I remember the words he used in that famous LRB piece in 1993, and describing what you're describing, how the PA colonized the PA, basically, and it eventually ends up becoming a tool of a subcontractor of Israeli colonization of the West Bank, which you opened the show with today, describing the horrors of your life and the life. So at what you worked with the PA, and this is not, I mean, just as a question, can you just explain for people who are not, who it's easy to criticize from the outside, but when you're inside, can you just explain to people why you made the decision to work with the PA, and at what point did people in the PA realize, or did they realize, that this is becoming a collaborationist body as opposed to having any kind of function in liberation terms? So that those are some, I think, important questions.
That's
maybe
a
you
good
could
question.
clarify.
Yeah. It's a gradual revelation. I mean, it's not an epiphany that suddenly people woke up and said, this is it. No, it unfolded. The reality became clear as time went on. From the beginning, I mean, I agreed with Edward on some of the issues, but I told him we have to give it a chance. Yes, these are flawed agreements. Yes, this is an agreement that separated the people. Sorry. An agreement that separated the people from the land, an agreement that dealt with functional issues rather than with territorial issues. Sorry. And an agreement of gradualism, where it left Israel, the occupying power, in full control of the system, and ended up transferring only functional administrative tasks to the Palestinians to run their own lives. And I remember I told Yasser Arafat then, and Edward also, that I mean, we were offered much more by the military governor when they were looking for village leagues and collaborators and people. They said, we will hand you over everything. I said, look, we can run our lives. We can run our schools, our hospitals, our roads. We can do all these things. We are perfectly capable. But what we need is for you to leave so we can do these things. But we won't do them under your control. And this was in the 1980s and early 19. And I told them that. So what they accepted in the agreements, and the Declaration of Principles, the DOP, and all subsequent agreements, was the functional approach, not the territorial approach. Nothing leading to sovereignty, but rather, devolution of power while maintaining Israel control as a sovereign power. That's the thing, because Israel constantly maintained that it has sovereign rights. It wasn't just acting as an occupying power. So the built-in flaws of the agreements became gradually worse and worse and worse, because when they signed the other subsequent agreements based on the flaws of the DOP, like transforming Palestine into letters of the alphabet, areas A, B, and C. And I said at that point we were living in ancient cities and ancient names and historical names, and we found ourselves inhabiting letters of the alphabet. This was ridiculous because that maintained Israel's control, and Israel treated Area C as though they were Israel's in order to annex and control and so on. And the powers and responsibilities, and the fact that the Israeli security was paramount, and they made the people under occupation responsible for the security of the occupier. As you know, I said this earlier. So all the worst flaws of the signed agreements came to be, I mean, the basis of all the problems that we are facing now. They managed to maintain Israel's control, and as the US says now, don't hold us responsible, don't interfere, we are in a delicate phase of negotiations. They always said that. And Israel got recognitions, Israel got agreements and economic agreements and so on the basis of the signed agreement. So that kind of asymmetrical relationship ran its course. It weakened the victim and it strengthened the occupier. And they maintained their control of the land, they maintained their settlement activities, and gradually it became very clear that there was ill will. There was never any intention of leaving, of ending the occupation, or of accepting self-determination or statehood or sovereignty for Palestine. Not a single government in Israel stopped the settlements. So that's what gradually weakened the whole political system. And everybody, not just Fatah, but all the different other factions and so on. And that's what gave rise and strength to Hamas in the late 80s, for example, because Israel was using the language of ideology and power and weapons and so on, while the PLO was using the language of negotiations and peaceful solutions and so on. So the asymmetry was maintained, and the fact that it became a system of control, and the fact that Israel could get away with all its oppressive measures and land confiscation and expansionism without any kind of accountability. And there was no intention on the part of the international community to engage, to interfere.
So, Dr. Hanan, on this point, Dr. Hanan, if I may just push you just on so it sounds like you're saying 1995, the second Oslo thing was the turning point, in a sense, of when you realized ABC, when these areas ABC were created. But given all that you study literature, and you have an educator, you're obviously an extraordinary educator, and you have long experience of the history of the Zionist project in Palestine. What made people on the ground in Palestine think that the Israelis would do anything but continue their colonization of the West Bank? Describing it, because again, we go back to where we are today. You're describing this unfathomable cruelty that you and people around you are being subjected to on a daily basis. And so what made you, and that's what I guess people on the outside who could be uncharitable, maybe they don't understand the situation inside, but I'm just wondering how, is it at some point, where is it just that you wanted to believe against the evidence, or that at some point you realized this was, again, because nobody doubts the positive will to change that you and people around you represented on the ground. You're trying to lead life and love and liberation and so on and so forth. But at what point, why did you, where does the history of the Zionist project that you know so well, what made you believe that they would change?
Think that they could change? Yeah, I tell you why. Several reasons. I think the most important reason was the first Intifada. I mean, you cannot believe the sense of confidence, the sense of resistance, let's say, of power that the people had with the Intifada, because it was a people's revolution, so to speak. And we stood up to the Israeli army, and we stood up to the weapons and machine guns and tanks and so on. And we asserted our rights and our identity and our will to resist and to survive and to thrive. This was really a moment of history and Palestinian history on the ground that showed tremendous self-confidence and tremendous optimism that we could change the course of history. We really believed that. I said at one point, when we went to Madrid, we had 40% support. When we came back from Madrid, we had 87% support, because we saw this as a political arena, as another part of struggle, as another part of confrontation, but you are facing your oppressor, and you are challenging your oppressor, and you are presenting yourself to the world. And of course, we had basis for the talks. We had an American letter of assurances that I also helped draft, because it was drafted in my house here. And I have 3-4 different drafts in which we said that the US does not approve of or does not condone settlement activities, nor does it recognize the annexation of Jerusalem, blah, 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 all these things. And so when the time came to ask them to implement their own policies, they said, this has nothing to do with negotiations. You talk to the Israelis, it's our... Anyway, so we insisted on getting clear terms of reference, on getting an American position if they wanted to be a peace broker and a sponsor of the talks. And so we thought we had things in place. And because we wanted to save the PLO that was in Tunis, that had been exiled and so on, we thought this was one way of bringing the PLO to the global political arena and presenting the Palestinian case in a global political arena in a context that was Arab, American, European, Russian, and Israeli. So we weren't alone subject. As I told James Baker then, I said, you're asking us to do something illegal because the people under occupation cannot be made to negotiate with their occupier. It violates the Fourth Geneva Convention, of course. And that's why we insisted on having the PLO there as our representative. So legitimate representative, by the way, I forgot to tell you, because there were many Arab countries that thought that they could take over the Palestinian cause and exploit it. And Israel was looking for village leagues and collaborators and so on. That's just an aside. That's why everybody was saying so legitimate representative, that Israel cannot create a collaborationist system and the Arabs could not take over the Palestinian cause for their own ends. We can talk about this later if you
But
want.
Dr. Hanan, but yeah,
that
in
was
fact,
an important...
No, that's super important. This is the history you're covering is incredibly powerful and important. But actually exactly on that question about the PLO as the sole legitimate representative, so one of the products of Oslo, as you're saying, is this kind of gradual colonization of the PLO by the PA, the kind of gradual assuming of these functions. Yeah, exactly. But also the functions, rather than sovereignty and liberation, it becomes like a functional administrative thing rather than a body for liberation, which is what the PLO was supposed to be. But the other thing that happened during Oslo one of the great virtues of the PLO is that it had, first of all, it had international standing, but it also represented, when we said sole legitimate representative, that means not just for the people under occupation, but for the people in 48, for the people, obviously the people in exile too, right? So in a way, part of what happened with Oslo is that those other parts of the Palestinian people kind of dropped out of the picture. Palestine became the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, which is obviously a core part of Palestine, but it's not the only part of Palestine. And above all, the people in exile they just disappeared. Like they didn't count anymore. So exactly, because the PLO focused so much on taking over, or the PA turned it into this kind of administrative function rather than the whole people. Like the whole people got forgotten somewhere in the shuffle too, which is an important part of the story, right?
Yeah, right. You're absolutely right. I think we touched on this briefly, but that's true. The importance of the PLO was its comprehensive representative ability and the fact that all Palestinians, since we were expelled. I mean, it's not just the fact that Palestinians were under occupation or treated within a colonial system or an apartheid system, but that they were expelled and living in exile. They were refugees and people in exile, and therefore they had the right to this political representation that was recognized globally. It was, and it had support and it had respect. And I think, unfortunately, it is partly the fault of the political leadership that it allowed the PLO to be weakened so much and to be dissolved within the PA. This is entirely unacceptable. That's why I said I accepted, also because the women wanted a woman and wanted me to run and wanted elections, so I ran. But I thought all along that we could work, we could strengthen, we could revitalize the PLO, we could restore it. At some point, there were people who said the PLO should not come to live under occupation. At one point, we said, why not delegate others to do the work under occupation and keep the PLO outside to be able to maintain its independence and its ability to move, its mobility and its freedom and so on. And this was met with total rejection. Saying, you want an alternative leadership? I said, no. I want, if you signed a functional agreement, then have administrators run the show, but don't bring the PLO to live under the occupation and at the mercy of Israel, which is what happened ultimately. And the nature of the agreement also. Yeah, it gave the PLO responsibilities and the PA of security, the security cooperation agreements and appendix are really extensive. The human rights are 2 paragraphs. I said, what kind of agreement is this where we talk about human rights and then you talk about security cooperation? And that's when I saw that the PA was supposed to, and the security forces were supposed to protect the settlers and the army, and not their own people.
Which year was this, Dr. Hanan?
But this was in the DOP actually, but it became clearer and clearer the more you saw all the appendices and all the agreements on security, the worse it became. Now, we never expected the Israelis to continue to behave with business as usual as an occupying power. All they did was that they imported the leadership to live under occupation, and they continued to build settlement activities, apartheid roads, discriminatory policies and practices, and so on. So it was business as occupation as usual. But they brought the leadership to live under occupation and to create a system. Now, to be honest, when we had the elections for the PLC, we were also overjoyed because we felt this was our right. This was a period in which we elect our representatives and we're setting up our system and we're going to have a legislative body with an oversight over the executive, and we'll have a government regardless of what you call it. And this is the beginning, this is the seed of statehood. This was the whole purpose of having a PA, to prepare for statehood, to transition from occupation and institutional work and so on, to statehood within a legal political system, frankly speaking. So people were quite excited about this and quite optimistic. So it's not a question of trusting the Israelis. It's a question of having a momentum where you could create facts. Now, Abu Ammar Yasser Arafat had the idea that, he told me once, you give me an inch, I turn it, or you give me a millimeter, I turn it into a meter or whatever. I said, you don't understand the Israelis. They might promise you a meter, but they won't give you a millimeter. I mean, we know them. We know how they are. We lived under occupation. So you cannot assume that you can outsmart them by, maneuvering the agreements. You cannot, because what they cannot maneuver and change, they will violate and ignore, which is exactly what they did. And the agreements, there were further redeployments. They were supposed to withdraw from different areas, A, B, and C, and so on, and hand over. There were all sorts of things that Israel totally violated. And yet the Palestinians...
Sorry, we want to come back to this, to what you're saying about the PA, and then Karim has a question about the PA specifically, especially right now, and for like the foreseeable future. But I want to, before we get there, just a quick question. The seat in the UN, which, as you pointed out, was so hard fought for. It took all the I don't know how long, years and years and years of struggling to get the seat for the PLO in the UN, in the General Assembly. And then as you pointed out, I think in passing, at one point, the PLO, this must have been before Oslo, but the PLO, I remember, had more international recognition than the Israeli state. The PLO had more embassies than the Israelis did, for example, in many other countries. So Mike, just a quick technical question. That's a super simple question. The seat in the UN, is that the PLO, the PA, like the state of Palestine? Who is that exactly? I mean, who actually is it?
No,
It's the PLO still.
It's the PLO. It remained the PLO because in 2012, when we got recognition as a state, albeit a non-member state, but a state, which is very important. And I think we should pursue this. It said in the agreement that this is based on the PLO position in the UN and the recognition of the PLO as state. And we maintain that the PLO is the sign of statehood for us. So there is no contradiction between the PLO and statehood at all. And the only way you can dissolve the PLO is if you have full independence and sovereignty, where you would have a body and a government and so on to represent all Palestinians everywhere and so on, like other countries. But so long as there is occupation, you will have to have a PLO. Even if you have a state, you got that statehood through the PLO. And the PLO is recognized. But they really undermine the standing of the PLO by increasing the powers of the PA, particularly when it's a question also of power. The military, the security forces were subject to the PA and the government and the president, not the PLO. The finances, the treasury was at the disposal of the PA, of the government, not the PLO. So the PLO became part of the overall, budget of the PA. So it didn't even have financial independence. I know when I said I wanted to see where all the embassies were, I wanted to see where all the refugees are, and I wanted to create a coordinating system and so on with them. There was no budget, there was nothing. You couldn't do any of these things. So it was a major battle to try to get that kind of connectivity with Palestinians outside in exile. So, there you go. Gradually, the process did not happen overnight. In the same way as the revelations of the absolutism of Zionism became clear on the ground, the revelation of the weakening and dissolution of the PLO became clear gradually as the PA became more powerful and took over. And of course now there's nothing that's powerful because they don't have the funding, they don't have anything, and they're trying desperately to maintain a system. But I don't take this lightly because the collapse of the PA now, that it has taken over all these responsibilities and so on, is a collapse of a whole system. We have to transform it, but we mustn't have a collapse because there are, I wouldn't say thousands, maybe even millions, dependent on a system that was created. You have the security forces, you have the civil service, you have the whole economy, you have everything that was built here that is on the verge of collapse. And if it collapses, it's going to be very detrimental. Yeah.
I think this is, what you're saying is really quite extraordinary and so important. And I think many people don't quite, this division between the PLO and the PA. And the idea that the PLO, in a sense, represents all the Palestinian people, from the refugees to the people outside, to the people inside, to Jerusalem, to everywhere. Whereas the PA doesn't represent, except the government within the territory, which is now basically Ramallah and a few of the areas there in Area A, a bit of Area B, really in kind of effectively. And the PLO is what is representing at the UN, again. So anything connected to this larger aspirations of the Palestinian people and self-determination is connected through the PLO. Everything that's connected to, let's say, local self-government and this kind of stuff is through the PA. But technically, the PA is under the PLO, right? It's the PLO that creates the PA. And so if the PA were somehow magically to dissolve, it would have to be through the PLO, as I understand it. So the question, this gets us to this incredible question, which is today, I think I had asked you earlier, I'm not sure if I heard you correctly, but today, where is the PA/PLO in talking about Gaza, what's going on in Gaza today? I don't mean at the UN, in the seat at the UN, which is presumably the PLO, but the PA itself. I'm not just saying it just for the sake of saying this, but the idea of saying, how do we, this disconnect that happened from Oslo onwards, as you were pointing out very, very importantly, that part of the Oslo process eventually we understood was to create these divisions and these separations among the different parts of the Palestinians. eventually also between Gaza and the West Bank. And here we are. This is kind of the end game of this thing. So what is the next step? I mean, how do you, I mean, as somebody who's worked within all these different bodies and who knows the ins and outs of this, at this point, I don't think anybody's really saying we should get rid of the PLO. Now it's a question, all the questions are how does one reform the PLO? How does one reform the PLO? How can you get proper elections? And how can you bring it back to the big questions of self-determination, liberation, all of this? We'd love to have your thoughts on that.
Yeah, absolutely. The real question is how do you reform, reorganize, revitalize the PLO? And this has been the agenda that we have been working for and I've been trying to push for years. And whenever we had meetings of the PNC and the PLC, this was the basis of our discussions in terms of the relationship with Israel, the relationship with the world, and the relationship between the PLO and the PA and so on. So it's now, as I said, the whole trajectory was moving towards weakening the PLO, strengthening the PA. Now, in this current situation, when you ask me where the PLO and the PA are, I would say they are missing in action because they are powerless. Neither the PLO has been reduced to a few people representing a few factions. That's it, plus Fatah. It is no longer the executive committee. It is no longer representative of all the political system. It doesn't have Hamas, it doesn't have Jihad Islami, and some of the factions that do not have a constituency even. But it's a very convenient political tool for the president to say, I have the PLO, and it is my decision-making body. But ultimately, the decision is the presidency. The decision-making body is the presidency, not the PLO. Let's be frank. I know many people don't like to hear this, but this is the truth. I was there, and we used to get ready-made decisions. I said, we didn't take these decisions, and if we disagree with them, I'm not going to defend them, and I'm not going to abide by them. We are supposed to take these decisions, but we ended up being handed down all these decisions. So the PLO, as we know it and as we want it, the executive committee, and including the PNC and the PLC, because the PLC has taken over all the powers of the National Council gradually. So the executive committee does not have the power anymore. The power now is with the PA because it has the money, it has the international connections, and so on. The world did not want to have ties with the PLO. You know that the US still considers the PLO a terrorist organization. And the reason they refused my visa when I wanted to come was because I was a member of the PLO and I was designated a terrorist. So that is, and now they're even saying that you don't have to be an official, you can be just an ordinary member of the PLO and you're a terrorist. So let's not forget that. All the ambassadors, the Palestinian, and you rightfully pointed out that we had more recognitions as Palestine than Israel did before the agreements. Israel got more recognitions after the agreement, but we had 135 recognitions. And we could go anywhere and be recognized. Now, the PLO, in a sense, is shelved a bit, and maybe the president will pick it up and use it as he sees fit, but because they themselves have allowed themselves to become that way. I remember I used to tell them, we have to resign, all of us, we have to leave. It took me several years to be able to resign. It's not easy to leave the system. And it takes women to leave. Men have their positions, they want to stay there, they want to hold on to power and privilege and so on. And I kept telling them, they said, no, you can do it, you're an independent, we have our factions, we have our employees, we have our people who have to stay in their jobs, and they're there because we are and the PLO. So that's why when you have factions that are dependent on their survival, not on their constituency, but on the presidency, then you relinquish your will and your political voice and your ability to be critical. I could be critical because I wasn't dependent on them. I neither wanted a position, nor did I want money, nor privilege, nor anything. And I was my own person, so I could leave. And even then, they tried very hard to destroy my reputation when I left, which didn't work, by the way. People know me. They know I never sought any position or privilege or anything. So it's very difficult to leave. But if you leave, you have to leave, as I said, a graceful exit. Leave with dignity, your own dignity intact. Do what is your own conscience, what your own values, what your own national, political, moral commitment would ask you, would tell you to do. And to me, I was serving the people, not the organization or anybody like that. So anyway, that's the question of the PLO button.
No, I just wanted to just to clarify something. So on the question of the PA, and I think maybe some of the thing that confuses us is because the same person, Abu Mazen, is heads the PA and heads the PLO and heads Fatah, and so it's you're never quite sure what hat he's wearing at any given moment. So it makes things confusing at that level. So the PA itself is the body that basically the Western donors, the Europeans in particular, and then through the UN and others, make everyone dependent on the PA for the public administration, for employment, for jobs. The Europeans are pumping money in for civil society, for NGOs. And meanwhile, they stopped doing this.
No more. Yeah, they're not pumping money into the PA.
And on the other hand, the PLO is this kind of political body, as you were saying, that is in dire need to kind of reform and have re-elections and kind of to revive this question of liberation and self-determination.
Revitalize.
So the question today...
Exactly. It's agenda. It has
please,
to...
No, I was going to ask about the question of Hamas at this stage, the question of Hamas. And now coming out, what is the role?
If you want... Yeah. No. If you want a legitimate, comprehensive, representative body, you have to have all political factions, parties, movements, organizations represented. You cannot have partial representation. And you cannot allow Israel to decide who's legitimate and who's not, and to pass out the label of terrorism here and there. And then the whole world sort of follows suit and says, yeah, Hamas, they're all terrorists. And when I said that Hamas is a movement that has social institutions, political arms, a military wing, and so on, they went crazy. How dare you say that? They are terrorists. I said, then you're designated, a large proportion of the Palestinian people as terrorists because it has also a political wing. Anyway, they don't want to understand that because Israel dictates the discourse, the diction. Israel dictates how you define the Palestinians. So you need to be able to have Hamas, Islamic Jihad, everybody else. There are more parties than those who are in the PLO who have no constituency, as I said. So you cannot select or choose who has the right to be part of the political Palestinian system. The hypocrisy is very clear when you see people who are real terrorists, who were designated as terrorists, like Smotrich and Ben Gvir, indefinite, in the Israeli government. The Kahana movement, the Kach movement, was designated as terrorists. And they speak, with just horrible pronouncements and statements about killing and death and destruction and racist statements and so on. And yet they are fine. They are there. They are part of a government that the world wants to maintain in place. And yet they give themselves the right. Like in 2006, when Hamas was elected and it got more seats than Fatah, the Palestinians were placed under sanctions, right? I said, look, Israel has been violating international law and our rights for decades, and you never use sanctions against Israel. But because we elected and chose the people you don't like, we were placed under sanctions. That sent a message clearly to the Palestinians that democracy is fine, provided you elect the people we want or we like. And they follow suit. Israel dictates the language, the choices, the priorities, frankly speaking. It's so cheap that when Israel says jump, the US and others say how high. It's very clear. So that's why We need to have, an inclusive, comprehensive political system. Otherwise, it won't be truly representative or democratic. Let the people choose. Why are you afraid of people choosing their representatives?
Dr. Hanan, so just to be clear for the viewers and listeners, Hamas right now is not part of the PLO, correct?
No.
It's not.
Hamas and
It's not
Islamic
part.
Jihad are not part. No. They ran for elections in the PLC when we had the Legislative Council, and they got more seats. They didn't get more votes, they got more seats.
But given the fact that Hamas, whether anyone likes it or not, Hamas has emerged as a result of what's going on now, especially with the genocide in Gaza, and their spokesman throughout all the various spokesmen, they seem to have emerged as the Palestinian national movement. So how do you reconcile given the reality of what we're talking about on the ground, how do you reconcile the fact that Hamas as an Islamist organization, at least in its ideology, how do you reconcile that with the secular orientation of the PLO? I mean, of course, these are both Palestinian. They both have grassroots organizations and so on and so forth. How do you reconcile that and the fact that Hamas is not part of the PLO right now, and yet it has emerged because of what's going on in Gaza, and because of the resistance, and because of everything that we see? They have emerged as they seem to have emerged as the national body at a time when the PA has completely disappeared, and as a national spokesman, and the PLO, as you said, has been in a state of decomposition that needs to be revitalized. So how do you reconcile these things? These are difficult.
Yeah, the national political movement has been sidelined, yes, and it has been weakened, and the national agenda has been weakened. Now, there's nothing that prevents different factions and movements and orientations from being part of the same national body, parliament. What's wrong with that? Because they form part of the public and part of the collective thinking and commitments of many people. But I doubt whether you can say that Hamas, emerged as the representative body. Hamas emerged because they are responding to Israel that targeted Hamas. And they made Hamas the devil and the enemy and so on. So Hamas is responding. And because Hamas is the active player in Gaza, they have more visibility and so on. Because in the West Bank, primarily, Fatah or the PA and the PLO are there. They don't have a role in there. They used to be able to fund, let's say, pay the salaries of hospitals, doctors, and school teachers, and so on in Gaza. But even that now is not allowed. So they found themselves on the periphery, on the sidelines of what's happening. And at the same time, they are being attacked. Now, Israel, by the way, says it doesn't want a PA. The US and Europe want to rejuvenate and revitalize and reform the PA and maybe have a titular president and maybe have a group of, they used to say technocrats, but we say no. You, if you want, you can have a group of, not you, but the Palestinians would like to have a group of people who are professional and national, not just choose them because they are technical or professional. We need the political dimension there all the time because it's not just a functional approach. But Hamas emerged because it is targeted and because they tried to brand all Palestinians in Gaza as Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist, therefore we have the right to kill all terrorists. This is what they're doing. And there is tremendous sympathy for the Palestinian people in Gaza, tremendous sympathy. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that this is going to translate into votes once the dust settles and so on. I think then you will go back to a sort of more normal alignments and distribution of votes because people support Hamas since it's under attack. If you look at public opinion polls, yes. But gradually in Gaza and so on elsewhere, if the situation gets back to normal, which is very difficult to think of normalcy, when you look at what's happening in Gaza and even in the West Bank. However, if there is a period of calm and in which people can reflect and think and vote, I think the vote will probably be more evenly distributed and will incorporate different factions and so on. So let's Let's not jump to conclusions. I mean, I would respect the will of the people once they are no longer traumatized and dying of starvation and thirst and disease and bullets and shells and bombs. No, that's not the issue now to me. That it's not who is the larger party, how do you reconcile secular and the religious. All countries have secular and religious parties. And I think it's perfectly legitimate, and we should be able to accommodate all these things. I may disagree with Hamas ideologically, but I will defend their right to be part of our national democratic system. Who gives people the right to decide who's legitimate and who's not? It's the people who will have to vote. But you can't have people vote right now, given the conditions. Every single Palestinian, not just in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, in exile, I'm sure you all are, we are all traumatized. We are all living in a state of total disruption because there is no logic that can encompass and can comprehend what is happening in Gaza. The sheer evil, the sheer power of destruction and death and devastation, the depravity of that is beyond belief. So as Palestinians, I think we should be able to have a reprieve to sit back and to think and to reach out to each other and to try to reformulate our whole political agenda and thinking and institutions and structures. So I find it perfectly disingenuous from the Americans to decide that they want a reformed PA. They don't talk about the PLO. They want a reformed PA. What's a reformed PA? I mean, the PA abided by its obligations as per the agreements. And that was the reason for its downfall, or a major reason. I wouldn't say the sole reason. A major reason, because people saw it abiding by its obligations, protecting the settlers and the army, the Israeli army, withdrawing when the army comes, and not protecting their own people. And I've seen several examples of that where people are saying, where were you when we needed you? You know. So that has undermined the standing and the credibility of the PA. And the fact that they couldn't deliver on their agenda. They adopted an agenda of peacemaking, of reconciliation, of a peaceful resolution to the so-called conflict. And that failed because there was no other side. Now, Israel always says the Palestinians did not want peace, or we do not have another side to talk peace to negotiate with. It's exactly the opposite. I think it's the fact that the PA and the Palestinian leadership was more than willing to negotiate, to work out a peaceful solution. Till now, they're talking about a negotiations process. And that's why you had people who emerged who are saying, you're not protecting us, we want to protect ourselves. That's why Israel is out there killing those people in Tulkarem and in Jenin and in Nablus and Qalqilia and so on, because they are saying we will protect ourselves because the army and the settlers are killing us and your security forces are not defending us, so we have to defend ourselves. And that's why you have a weakening of the credibility also of the PA and all the security. Now they want to retrain the security forces. They want to better equip them to be able to protect the security of Israel because, as I said before, it's the great God security that determines, and Israel's security, defined in military terms, that determines how you deal with the whole region, not just with Palestine. And the repositioning of Israel.
Sorry to drop that, but you've used these kind of very profound words and images like evil that's going on in Gaza today, and it's difficult to think of it in any other way.
I rarely use that term, but
all of us.
I couldn't find another.
It's truly incomprehensible. And you've talked about the settlers kind of rampaging through the West Bank and other areas, and the kind of fear in Jerusalem and among Palestinians inside 48, and so there's this kind of assault at all levels, on the Palestinians. And so the question that I have here is, just sort of looking forward, the American plan, the Saudi plan, the Egyptian plan, they're all planning the kind of the day after, this infamous day after, on the assumption Hamas is somehow going to be destroyed or something, and that there's going to be this day after, and which, as you mentioned, supposedly the PA is supposed to fall in line and kind of do whatever the U.S. basically tells it to do, fix up its security, and somehow replace Hamas, and these kinds of strange scenarios. So the questions from the Palestinian side, I mean, that seems to be pretty clear what they want, which doesn't seem very achievable, but they're just saying it, I suspect, because they need to pitch some form of negotiation to kind of justify the kind of rampaging and the kind of genocide that's taking place. But within the Palestinian, within the Palestinian body politic itself, are there now, at least now, approaches between Fatah, between Hamas, between others on the political front, which they understand clearly there needs to be this reconciliation in order to pose what the Palestinians want, not just saying we want humanitarian this and we need we need ceasefire, etc., but the actual politics of it. If you could tell us give us an insight, what's going on, and do you see this as something that can gather steam and that's something real that's going to happen, or do you think it's going to fall apart as Egypt and Saudi Arabia and America pressure?
Yeah, I think, look, the basis of the Israeli policy with Palestine has always been fragmentation. As you know, fragmentation of the people and the land. They want the Palestinians outside to be separate, the Palestinians in Israel to be something else, Jerusalem another thing, Gaza another, the West Bank another. So it's demographic and political separation. And then add to that geographic fragmentation and separation. And this is one system of control that Israel has always used. And I think one thing that irks Israel is the fact that the Palestinians insist on their national unity, on the fact that we are one people. In 2021, remember, when everybody rose inside Israel, in the West Bank, in Jerusalem, in Gaza, and so on, that sent a clear message, and of course in exile, that we are one people, one nation, no matter what you do, and no matter how you try to separate us, we are one. And we have the same commitments, the same feeling. Now, I was in Qatar and I saw there was a meeting and it was a sort of conference, and there were hundreds and hundreds of Palestinians from everywhere, from the West Bank and Gaza, from Jerusalem, from 48 Palestine, from exile. And it was amazing how people were thinking together. And here also there are all sorts of meetings and civil society and others trying to come up with a sort of collective, cohesive national agenda, and not to allow it to be hijacked by people who are looking at the day after. What is the day after? It is our decision, it is our choice to see how to reform or repair or rejuvenate or re-energize our own political system. And we have to have our own political agenda. So yes, there is. I felt that there was really a vibrant movement, a very active movement among Palestinians everywhere. And I would like people, wherever they are, to be able to have their say, to have an input in this conversation. It's very important because it is not exclusive to one group or the other. So I'm glad you raised this issue, because everybody is trying to define the Palestinian leadership and who is there to take control to serve the interests of the Americans and Israel. Now, Israel doesn't want any Palestinian, as you know. They don't want Hamas, they want to destroy it, they want to get rid of it, they don't want it to rise, they don't want it to be part of any kind of governing system or body, and that's it, they're finished. They don't want the PA because the PA gives money, because the PA funds the prisoners who are our captives in Israeli jails. And so they are funding terrorism, so we don't want these people. So they don't want the PA. What they want is to have a series of fragmentation, of fragmented Bantustans that are run by village leagues. They even started using the term tribes. They want to revive the tribal system in Palestine. I mean, they tried the village leagues before in the 70s and early 80s, and they failed. Now they're trying tribes, because when they fragment you and turn you into these isolated population centers, the most you can hope for is a localized system of not even governance, but government. Like you can have maybe you can elect your mayor, or maybe you can have the powerful, as during the British Mandate, and they have the dignitaries and all these people, the Qa'am Maqam and all these guys running the show. That's what they want. I mean, they have a typical regressive colonial mentality, and they seem to think that Palestinian reality will shape itself according to their own ideas and their own Zionist, because to them, the only good Palestinian is a Zionist, by the way. You know that. So it's not going to work. To us, the change that needs to be seen is a change in this fascist Israeli government. Instead of looking at the helpless Palestinian leadership, look at the Israeli government. Look at, hear, listen to what they say, read what they write, look at what they're doing. This is what needs to change. Even in the US, look at your government in the US. Yeah, that's where you need to see real change. That's where people need to have soul searching, real self-examination, and as we talked about earlier, a critical distance to see where they've gone wrong, what they've done. But the US, anyway, is not motivated by morality and so on. We know what's happening. We know that redividing the world, repositioning Israel, their own interests, in addition to their own Zionist commitments, these are shaping what's happening now. And they think that they can revive the colonial mentality the way they tried when they invaded Iraq and killed 1.5 million Arabs and got away with it. That they can do the same now. You can't do the same now. As you rightfully said, there's a younger generation that knows. And there are minorities and groups that also know and have placed Palestine in the heart of the global conversation on rights and freedom and justice. We are part of this global conversation now, fortunately, but at a tremendous price. Now, how long can this go on, this situation of carnage and destruction? It's not up to the Palestinians. It's Israel that is hell-bent on continuing, and they managed to take the whole public opinion with a very, very, very tiny, minuscule minority in Israel. They're justifying what's happening. They're justifying the slaughter and the massacres and the genocide. And the US is helping them. If it hadn't been for the younger people and the shifting in public opinion and votes and so on, there was no reason for Biden to start talking about the Palestinians must be helped. You notice how he used the passive voice. Must be helped how and by whom?
That's the perfect place, Dr. Hanan. You've been so generous with your time. That's the perfect place to stop. Exactly on that note, the Palestinians will help themselves. I think that's one of the themes you've been speaking to here, and will represent themselves. And I think one of the most interesting things is, I live in Los Angeles now, and Genocide Joe is visiting LA today to go specifically to a fundraiser at the home of a guy called Haim Saban, who's a major. And it has to do specifically with support for Israel. But I can assure you, wherever he goes in LA, there will be protests everywhere he goes. He's a deeply unpopular, deeply divisive president. And the good news, if there is good news here, I think there's some good news that we can look, we can anticipate. Palestinians are looking to the future. You just said it now. The youth in America they're looking to the future, right? But what the Israeli government and the American government, they're looking at the 18th century. They don't realize they're out of sync with. They were completely regressive. They're stuck in an older kind of model of settler colonial racism and so forth. I don't think they get it. I think they don't see where we're going in the future. And so all I can say is, from on behalf of all of us, thank you so much for spending your time with us. And we'll keep following your work and hope that things end in Gaza as soon as they can, and that Palestine is liberated soon enough. Thank you, Dr. Hanan.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hanan. Thank you so much.
Thank you for hosting me. It's my pleasure.
Thank you, Dr. Hanan. And thank you for all your work.
Guys, that was an amazing discussion with Hanan Ashrawi, who's, she's seared into all of our consciousness back, whatever, 30 years ago, whatever it was. And she's an extraordinary person. And I thought
From Ted Couple,
some amazing things. It was,
1988.
yeah, it was
From
back in the
1988,
80s.
Ted
I
Couple.
remember. So what did you think?
I thought she was incredibly eloquent, and I think she's speaking from the heart, and also from her experience, her actual political experience with the PLO, with the PA, with the PNC, and so on. I think the one issue that comes up over and over again is this question that we've danced around in our various discussions with Palestinians on the ground, so to speak, on the ground in quotation marks, in the sense that she worked on the inside, and yet she came to a realization that this entire split, the decomposition of the PLO and the rising of the PA, the rise of the PA, was a collaborationist process. And it's an interesting thing to see how she was working in the inside, and she came to that realization. Although I wasn't clear when that actually occurred, at what point specifically. But and Karim, we were talking about yeah.
Well, I think she said, I think she said that there wasn't one moment that it was.
Over time. It was
It
cumulative.
wasn't one moment. It was just something that was, it was gradual. There was no one.
Yeah,
there was
that's
no
a good
one
point.
epiphany
Yes.
kind of moment in there.
But did you understand in the end?
that
I
was
mean, did
definitely-
you understand in the end who represent? I'm still Karim. Maybe you can explain this to us and to our listeners and viewers. Who is the representative at the UN? Is it appointed by the PA or the PLO?
PLO.
Okay, but who
the PLO?
But who appoints those people?
PLO. No, PLO.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, Mahmoud Abbas is the same guy. That's
It's through the PLO.
Yeah, but Abbas is the head of the PA and the
But that's
PLO.
the point. It's become a presidential system. That's what she was saying. That it's a very heavily presidential by decree system where the same guy is head of Fatah, head of PLO, and head of the PA. So it's kind of moot in that sense. And so part of all the reforms that need to happen, and part of the changing the way the PLO is, and is to change all of these different aspects and make things much clearer. And I mean, the question that for me was interesting is to say, okay, you have this PA, you have this PLO, and the PA that's created, that was at the time anyway funded by the Europeans and by the West, etc., that provided all these jobs and therefore for families, and then they're also funding the civil society at that point. And they were weakening the PLO as much as possible. And the PLO is what really represents the politics and represents all the Palestinians, represents the right of return, it represents liberation, it represents, it's kind of the global South connection. It connects all of this, as opposed to the PA, which is this corrupt thing. It's corrupt on the one hand. On the other hand, a lot of people, regular, ordinary people, depend on it for jobs, for money, for funding, for all sorts of things.
I mean, it was a brilliant move on the part of the Israelis.
So,
to hand it to them.
So the question,
it's like this
the Americans, I think, are, the Israelis. Yeah. So the question is now, and this was the question it's been for over a decade. People have been talking, how do you reform the PLO? How do you do the new charter? How do you bring Hamas now into the PLO? But the question beyond all this is, are Fatah and Hamas talking? The question is, are Fatah and Hamas talking? Are they? Is there some kind of dialogue taking place? What I wasn't clear with Hanan was, and maybe I mean, these are ongoing, so who knows? But the question is, these discussions have to be happening now. I mean, it's not later. It's not. We need to. The Palestinians need to represent themselves, of course. But this kind of so-called day after scenario is not going to be so far off. So, is there discussions taking place now? Is there reconciliation attempts taking place now? Or is everybody basically dependent on Qatar and then Egypt and Saudi Arabia and America and all these other kind of countries that don't have the best interest of Palestinians?
It's worth discussing. I think it's a dialectic. It's all these things happening at the same time, and that's where I don't think she could answer that question. It's an impossible question in a sense to answer. But listen,
no, of course not. No, it's a question. It's a general question, I think, for all of us to think about this.
Let's wrap on this, and also look forward to our next podcast soon, hopefully. All right, guys.
And to our Patreon, please. We're looking forward to seeing people on Patreon too, where you can ask us questions, suggest topics for future shows. There'll be a Q&A show coming up.
And give us feedback as well.
Feedback.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Thank you,
All
everyone.
right, bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.